this is the third lecture, and I'd like to start, well, before I start. So there are these hours on Friday set aside for anybody who is interested to know more. You can describe them as office hours, but it's not office hours where only one person is admitted at a time. The next 2 Fridays, tomorrow and tomorrow week, this will be in Salle 1 or 1. I don't, in this building, I don't know exactly where it is, well, I'll find out, but the portier will, you probably all know where it is. In any case, so Salle, no, can't write it down. And then just to get started, last week, the main part of the lecture was devoted to the actual construction by an interpreter of a logical form in the sense of MSDRT for a few sentences that have the form of attitude reports. And the last example we looked at was this one that is in boldface here. That is a report consisting of 2 attitude attributions to the same agent at the same time in this case. And I already said at the very beginning, to be able to deal with the semantics of such compound attributions or compound reports was the original motivation for getting MSD underway. And so it was natural to look at least one example of this kind. Now, we spent a lot of time explaining how the presupposition generated by this stop raining, that there was a condition of rain that came to an end. So the presupposition is that there was this condition. How that presupposition can be justified by the content of the belief that's attributed in the first sentence. And we saw that there's actually a fairly complicated mechanism that's more complicated than what you find with ordinary cases of presupposition justification and anaphora resolution when there are no attitudes involved. But before we got there, we started actually by looking just at this first sentence on its own. And there we saw something that's going to be crucial for everything that's going to follow, namely this second central feature of the formalism, the logical form languages that MSDRT makes available, and that is this predicate at. Remember, one of the ingredients of MSDRT is these MSDs, these mental state descriptions, which are sets of attitude, propositional attitudes, and entity representations. And this at predicate gives you a way of actually integrating those into the kind of logical form language that we want, which is basically an extension of the logical form languages of DRT. And this predicate at is a full-place predicate. It has a referential argument, as it's called in DRT. That's a state, and the state is to the effect that this predication holds. And what this predication says, so the last 3 arguments, is that the agent A is in a mental state at the time when this S holds, and that state is described by this MSD in third position. And then there's this link set that we haven't said anything about, but that will come later today. So we have almost all the really central ingredients of the formalism now in place. What I was very careful about, it was also the cause of some awkwardness, is in these first examples to have complement sentences that don't involve any real argument DPs, argument noun phrases. So that's why I chose this weather verb, sorry. And so the connection here was between what this says and this presupposition here. What we are going to look at today, in all the examples, is really important, is attributions where you have proper names, it's just going to be proper names here, in the complement sentences of these attitudinal verbs. And before we do that, though, I want to go back to something that we had a quick look at already, the very first lecture, where I talked briefly about this very simple sentence, Mary is in Paris, with these two proper names, Mary and Paris, and basically forget about what the rest on the slide. What I there presented was still at the very beginning of our explorations. Let me see, there's something funny here. So the suggestion was that in order for the speaker S of this very simple sentence to be in a position to correctly and sincerely utter this sentence, she must first have these entity representations for the names she uses, and then in addition she must have the belief, that's the sincerity part, that this proposition that she utters, namely of Mary being in Paris, being true. So the proposition here, once more, that's given by this DRS here makes use of the distinguished discourse reference for these name-labeled entity representations for Mary and Paris. And then the further assumption was, I don't quite know what, that the interpreter in the ideal situation should also come to the process of interpretation by already having entity representations for these entities that the speaker refers to by these names, Mary and Paris, and he uses those then in the interpretation, and if he also accepts what the speaker says as true, then he'll form a belief to that effect, and so the interpreter will, in the ideal case, then end up with a structure, a mental state of the relevant part of which is this, his entity representations already in place, and the belief that is now formed on the basis of what the speaker has said. Now, that story was incomplete in the first place because they didn't say anything about how this representation here is constructed from the actual sentence that he hears. But there is also another respect in which the story here is incomplete. And that's one that really matters now. And that is that the event of interpretation on the part of H is assumed in MSDRT to leave certain traces with the entity representations that he uses to interpret those names. And to see what's involved, actually are not quite the same thing in the two cases, but let us first look at a case where H doesn't satisfy these optimal conditions of having entity representations for these two names that he can use in the interpretation. So in particular, it's a more natural assumption. Let's suppose that he doesn't have this first entity representation for Mary. And now, as I said already in the first lecture, what he has to do is, can do and must do, is accommodate an entity representation for the person that S has just referred to by her use of Mary. And so that entity representation that he then accommodates for Mary so as to make the whole thing fit in his interpretation, is an entity representation of the kind shown here. And here you for the first, well, not for the first time, but here you see another case of actually an anchor in this anchor set. So this again is a singleton set, and it's got this one anchor, and this anchor is a vicarious anchor. And vicarious anchors are going to be very important in everything that's going to come. And they generally have the form, here it's instantiated, but you can recognize the general form, of saying, well, there was this event of the speaker, the SH is the distinguished discourse referent of the entity representation that H is supposed to have of S. I'm not actually showing that here, but that's very natural that you should have an entity representation for the speaker. So this says that the speaker just used this expression, here the name Mary, to refer to, well, what it is this entity representation represents. So this MH here is actually the distinguished discourse referent of the entity representation itself. So you might say this actually says, well, I am referring, entity representation, to whatever S was referring to by using the name Mary on this occasion. There's a kind of self-reference, you might say, involved in specifying what the reference of this entity representation is via this vicarious anchor. So that is the general form of a vicarious anchor. And as I said, when H has to accommodate an ER to deal with the name used by the speaker, this is what he will come up with. And this anchor you can see as a kind of commitment on the part of the interpreter for this entity representation to whatever it was that the speaker used the expression to refer to. And of course, since we are assuming the speakers can use names only when they have labeled entity representations that justify the use of the name, this vicarious anchor can be seen as a connection also between H's entity representation here and the speaker that he supposes S must have, because otherwise he can assume she wouldn't have used the name Mary. So this anchor actually does a double function. On the one hand, it fixes the referent of the entity representation, the entity represented by it, and at the same time, it forms a kind of intersubjective link between H's entity representation and the one that, if he is right, S had when she used the name. So there is this kind of double function here, and that's important to keep in mind. The intersubjective aspect, the connection between entity representations in the mind of one person and entity representation in the mind of another, is going to be increasingly important, very important in the lecture on fiction next week. And you can already at this point observe what we see in the case of accommodated entity representations is basically, you might say, MSDRT's explication of the Kripkean idea, naming a necessity that names get introduced somehow and then spread through the community by a process of uttering and interpreting, where the interpreter takes over the name with its referent from the speaker. So what you get by way of accommodating this entity representation with this vicarious anchor is, you might say, one link in what can, with time, become a very long causal chain that connects speakers or interpreters to the original introduction of the name. So that's the general form of a vicarious anchor. I think I've said basically what's on here. Let's go on. So here then, once more, what H should arrive at by way of his new mental state on the basis of his interpretation in the case where he has to accommodate this ER for Mary. Now the further point about vicarious anchors and vicarious anchoring is that, further assumption of MSDRT, this adding of a vicarious anchor occurs not only in the case where the interpreter makes up, accommodates an entity representation for a name that he so far wasn't familiar with. It also happens in those cases where the interpreter already had the entity representation. And in those cases, the vicarious anchor doesn't fix the referent of the entity representation, or the declaration of refer to whatever it was the speaker was talking about. It's rather a kind of confirmation of this exchange having taken place between S and H. And so this vicarious anchor testifying to this event then gets added to an anchor set that may already have elements in it. And so in this way, this is one of the ways in which anchor sets can grow, and the fact that anchor sets can have more than one, and very often large numbers even, of anchors in it is something that's also going to be important. So actually, what I've shown here is not quite, well, it's not wrong, but this just abbreviation of the anchor set for Paris, we were assuming that H already had this entity representation when he started the interpretation. That has now also got a new vicarious anchor reflecting the speaker's use of the name Paris. So, I've already said this. Oops, sorry. Don't know what. Okay, I've said this also. One way in which you can think of what the interpreter does when he adds these vicarious anchors is that he's really recording a recognition, that is, when he had the entity representation already. He recognizes the speaker's use of the name as her referring to something that he already knows, and knows in the form of the entity representation that he uses to interpret the speaker's use of the name. So, in fact, this is just one type of case of how, well, the story that MSDRT has to tell about what recognition of entities is in general. Whenever I recognize, in whatever way, an object or a person, that means, on this analysis, I have an entity representation for that thing or person. I now am put into causal contact with an individual. This is something that in the very beginning, in the first lecture, we described as forming an entity representation with a perceptual anchor, say, in the case where I see the individual or a thing, and adding a corresponding anchor to my entity representation, a way of saying the thing I'm seeing now, or the thing that I come into contact with in some other way, is the very same thing that this entity representation represent. So recognition, this is not just a matter of language. Recognition in MSDRT is putting together what you are in contact with right now with what is represented by an entity of representation you already had. So that's all I want to say right now about anchoring and recognition. And it can take all sorts of forms. The example that I just gave, that's a case of adding a perceptual anchor to the entity representation you already had, not a vicarious one. Good. So, a very brief remark, and I'm not going to say more about this, although it's an important and interesting subject, is that I already said that the anchor sets can get very big. And the reason is that, well, you can encounter the same thing over and over again. And as the story is told, each time the anchor set gets a new anchor. And that seems to be psychologically sort of implausible. And one answer to this is, well, it's actually a double answer. The first is to say, well, in as much as these anchor sets keep growing and growing and growing, that's a sort of abstract description from the outside of the causal history of this entity representation in the mind of the given agent. And the other observation is that when you want to think about these anchor sets from a more psychological perspective, some of these anchors actually get lost, they're gone forever. So that's a different way of defining what the anchor sets are over time. They not only can grow, they also can shrink. And then in addition, that's also going to be very important further applications. These anchors that are in the anchor set, now from the point of view of the agent that does something with that information, remembering where he got these entity representations from, some of these anchors may be active and others may be dormant. They may not have disappeared altogether, but they're sort of not directly accessible to the agent at that particular point. So this is just a hint of something that has to be worked out in much greater detail, and that I can't go into here. There are two other main subjects that I also want to refer to or mention very briefly. I had a lot of slides on that, on these two topics, which I had to cut, but they will be in the version that will be put online. The first has to do with fallibility of anchoring. And there are two kinds of fallibility that have to be distinguished. The first has to do just with single anchors. Take again the case of this agent that is walking along the road and thinks she's seeing this coin lying in the middle of the tarmac. And, well, so far we just assumed that it was a veridical experience and that her forming an entity representation for the thing she sees was correct. But of course, it's also possible that there was some kind of optical illusion. There was nothing there at all. And in that case, the entity representation as she forms with that perceptual anchor, she will still do that, it's all what goes on in her mind, is ill-founded. That entity representation won't represent anything. So that's a case of a fake anchor, in this case, a perceptual anchor. Vicarious anchors can also be fake. For instance, well, I mentioned, when I have time, this example later on, when you have, say, Mummy and Johnny talking about Santa, and Mummy says something about Santa, and Johnny, who believes that Santa exists, will actually then add to his entity representation, not a good one, of course, but his entity representation in response to what Mummy says, a vicarious anchor for the Santa that he believes to really exist. And that vicarious anchor also is then fake, because Mummy isn't really referring to any particular individual, not only by her own standards. Okay, so that's one way in which anchoring can go wrong. More important for purposes that relate to philosophical applications or discussions of the issues I'm bringing up here is something that has to do with not single anchors, but anchor sets. What easily can happen is that among all the anchors in your set, there will be some pointing towards one entity and some to another. So that's incoherence, and what you get has been discussed in the literature as partial reference. I don't know that the term partial reference is very helpful, but the idea is such an entity representation now in MSDRT terms partially refers to the one entity that some of its anchors point to and partially to the other. An interesting question about incoherence is that very often it doesn't really matter all that much. There are lots of harmless cases. Here's just one. I walk along the street and there's someone on the other side of the street is walking some distance in front of me, and this is Mary. And then she disappears around the corner, and that's it. It wasn't Mary, so my anchor for the person I see at this point corrupts the anchor set that I had in my entity representation for Mary, if it wasn't corrupted already. But if there isn't really no important information that comes with this mistaken identification of this person and it just then disappears again, that really won't be too much of a trouble to my use of my entity representation for Mary in various deliberations that it might enter into. In other cases, when there is a lot of anchors pointing to object D1 and a lot that point to object D2, and so each of those encounters that these anchors are witness to have brought in significant information about who it is that is represented by the entity representation. That can be a real trouble, and the problem, I think, François Recanati uses the term fish in this case. What you do or have to do when you finally discover there is something incoherent about this anchor set and the properties that are associated with it can be very difficult to actually sort of separate all the stuff that's now attached to this one entity representation into separate or distinct entity representations, one for the one object and one for the other. That's all I want to say about fallibility of anchoring. Another theme about which I cannot say very much is temporal continuity of mental states and mental state constituents. In a way, that's perfectly clear that that's the case, and my talking about entity representations has already implied that I was talking about these entity representations gathering more anchors in the course of time. This is, of course, only possible when the entity representation exists over some period of time. And the same is true for the propositional attitudes that are part of mental states. So you can think of the mental state of an agent as sort of covering her entire mental lifetime. And it changes over time, of course, and one way in which it changes is that some new constituents get added, new entity representations and new propositional attitudes, and others disappear or are rejected or maybe sometimes just forgotten. So the mental state is a kind of, you can think of it as a sort of thread throughout the agent's mental life that's spun together from these various constituents that are the fibers. These are the entity representations and the propositional attitudes that the agent entertains for certain amounts of time, but not for necessarily her entire life. The further question about temporal continuity is that when you look at the individual constituents, the propositional attitudes, and the entity representations, okay, so typically they hold only for a certain part of the entire lifetime of the agent, but while they hold, can they change in certain ways? Well, again, the answer, if it's just a matter of having one case, has already been given. These entity representations can change, and very often do change, after they've been introduced by getting more anchors. But actually there are all sorts of other ways in which it's reasonable to assume that not only entity representations, but also propositional attitudes change over time. One example for a propositional attitude is intentions. Intentions, especially as they occur as components of plans that you make in order to achieve a certain goal. The intention very often cannot be spelled out in sufficient detail that you would need to actually execute it. But the details will then have to be found later, and a certain amount of effort in planning has to do with actually finding the relevant information. And as more content gets added to the intention, it seems reasonable to say, nevertheless, that it's still the same intention. It's placed the same part in the wider context of the plan as a way of finally achieving the goal. There are other examples too. Again, I just indicate that there is a lot to be said and thought through here, and will not say more about it. So, a last point, also having to do with temporal profiles and change, has to do with not just the mental life of a particular agent, but with the speech community of which an agent is part. And here, what is important is these links that I mentioned earlier get established by vicarious anchors. They provide links within agents that are members of the speech community, and these causal chains that we have been talking about a great deal ever since I quickly brought them up, they are features of the speech community, diachronically seen. So again, in the lecture on fiction next week, causal chains and their histories will play an important part. One final remark here is, so the MSDs that I showed you, and that we are actually going to use for pretty much everything, certainly today, they are snapshots of mental states. And I just say the mental state that the agent had at this particular time has to have the properties that such an MSD spells out. It's just about what the mental state is at that particular time. A proper description that allows us also to track individual mental state constituents, entity representations, and propositional attitudes, will have to sort of be able to string these constituents of mental states as snapshots together to make it possible to reconstruct exactly when and how long for a particular constituent lasted. That requires a certain kind of notation, some kind or another. It's sort of technical, and it's not particularly interesting, but I want to just draw your attention to that being necessary also. So we will stick in what I'm going to tell you here to these snapshots, but they are really snapshots. The snapshot descriptions of somebody's mental states are part of the somewhat stronger formalism that actually allows for this tracking also. So now, finally, we get to a attitude report with proper names, and where two of the proper names, the Mary here and the Paris here, are inside the specification of the attributed attitude, the attributed belief. Now, what are the conditions that S must satisfy to legitimately say such a thing? and what are the conditions, or what are the things that the interpreter has to do in order to form a correct or legitimate interpretation of what she says. Part of the story I've already told you when we talked about the sentence Mary is in Paris. Both speaker and interpreter must have entity representations for all the names, here John, Mary, and Paris, and these must be labeled, these entity representations, with these names, just as they've seen before, and similarly the interpreter has to either have such entity representations already or else accommodate them. But in addition, this is another claim I'm now making, when names occur in the content specifications of the attributed attitudes, there is a further constraint which has to do with what really the function is of these names in these reports. And the claim I'm making, the proposal, the suggestion I'm making is that when the speaker uses names in such content specifications, what she is really doing is attribute to the attributee a belief, in this case, with a singular proposition as content, a proposition that is about what the entities that she refers to by using those names. So that means that if the speaker is legitimate in saying this sentence in A, then she will have to have not only, just as in earlier cases, she'll have to have herself a belief that the belief she attributes is correct, a belief that what she says when she says this sentence is true. And that now looks, like this. So here we have, the speaker must have entity representations, as I said, for the individuals that she uses the names for, and I've lists them here horizontally. And then she has to have a belief to the effect that the attributee has the belief that she attributes to him. That is represented by, in a DRS, where the main part is such an attitude condition, and the attitude condition attributes to, this is her discourse reference for John, attributes to John a mental state that also has entity representations for these two names that she uses in the specification of the content, Mary and Paris, and his content, the content of belief that she attributes to him, must be a singular proposition about the entities represented by these entity representations that he is supposed to have. And then what the speaker is committed to in addition is, here you see for the first time something real inside this link set argument position of at. She is actually trying to say that this singular proposition that she takes the attributee to have, that is about the entities that on the one hand are represented by these entity representations that she assumes to be part of his mental state, W and C here. And at the same time, those are supposed to be the individuals, the entities that she represents herself by way of her entity representations here and there. So with WM here is a link between the entity representation of the attributee here and her own entity representation from Mary. So this makes her attribution not only one of a singular proposition to the attributee, to John, but in fact a singular proposition that is, as it happens, or as is the case, about the entities represented by her own entity representations for those names. So there is, you might say, a kind of three-way connection that's established by an attribution of the kind we're looking at. On the one hand, between the speaker and the hearer, that's what we saw before, but in addition, there is then also this connection of a quite special kind between the speaker and the attributee. And the hearer, when he then interprets what the speaker has said, he also has to do basically the same thing. I'm not going to show you the diagram of that, but he is supposed to arrive in the end also with an attribution to John, which the hearer will also represent in this way, assuming that the attributee has these entity representations and that the entities represented by those are what the belief is about. So, I've said this, and I've said this. Okay. So, that is the main crux of how names in the specification of propositional attitudes that are being attributed are to be understood. Now, as a brief interlude, it should perhaps already be clear that by having these two ingredients, on the one hand the MSDs, these mental state descriptions, and on the other hand the at predicate, you actually sort of close a circle, you might say. And it consists, on the one hand, as I already said, in integrating these MSDs in representations, logical forms that have the form of DRSs, and where you have these specific, using this predicate at, the specific attributions of certain mental states to agents at certain times, and that information can co-occur in such a DRS with lots of other information, just as we would want it. We want, in principle, to be able to process attitude attributions as part of larger discourses where a lot of other kinds of things are discussed also. But this kind of circle also has the consequence that you can, without further ado, process iterated attributions. Iterated attributions, I think, almost been really a stumbling block for many accounts that have tried to deal with it. In this particular case, it's sort of clear, and the next representation, actually this is the first part of it, next on the next slide, sort of indicates how this works. Here we've got again, say, it is now the interpreter of such an iterated attribution. He has, again, the relevant, you assume, entity representations for the individuals mentioned by name in the report, and then he must also assume that the attributee, this is the outer attributee, John, is in a certain mental state that justifies him, assigning or attributing to John the belief that's described in the sentence. So this looks exactly the same so far, almost exactly the same as what we've seen before. And the only difference is that previously this characterization developed as of the belief context, that was a simple DRS, but now we've got this part, and what that is like is what you see here. So let me just go back. Here you see this is just one of the conditions of this condition set of this DRS. And this now is an at predication. And the at predications, this is now on the part of, this is what H attributes to John as his attribution of a belief to Mary. This at predication says, sort of from the perspective of John, that Mary is an mental state which consists of having an entity of representation for Bill, that was the one of Bill is sick, and then a content representation that looks like that. And if you've got reports involving not an iteration of depth 2, but of depth 3, Fred believes that, John believes that, Mary believes, and so forth, and it doesn't have to be there always beliefs, it could be other attitude verbs too, then that will go on. I hope that's clear. Then you would get another thing in this belief box with such a thing. That's a bit like what we had here. Okay, so now this looks like it's just notation, and perhaps you can sort of see how you write things down. What is really important and very hard about this is what the actual semantics of these logical forms is, or these logical form languages that MSDRT makes available. That has to be sorted out in the model theory for these logical form languages. That turns out to be a great headache, and I think I already said I would have liked very much to say more about that, and in a way I feel I owe that to you. But the matter is really quite complicated, and I decided there's just no way of going into this at a level of depth, even if it doesn't go into it very deeply. That would be of any use. So I apologize for that, but so this is just then to show you that the formalism for representing various kinds of things that we say, various kinds of, about the minds of other people, various attitude attributions. As a formalism of doing that is actually quite rich and strong. So now in the remaining minutes, I will do two things. I will begin, but only begin, a discussion of attitude reports that involve empty names. And I will concentrate, because so many people know that example and what people have said about it, on this empty name Vulcan that especially the philosophical community has been talking about ever since Kripke brought it up in Naming and Necessity. A name that was introduced in the conviction that it properly denoted, but as things turned out, it didn't. And since this name is around and has survived since the time when the astronomer Leverrier introduced it, it also can be used in attitude attributions. And we'll actually look at a couple of, basically only one, attribution to Leverrier, which has the name Vulcan in the complement sentence of the attitudinal verb. Will be again the verb believe. And we will then see that on the one hand, that is actually quite similar, according to the story I'm going to tell you, to what happens when people interpret, utter and interpret attributions with properly denoting names in the complements. But there's also going to be an absolutely crucial difference, which has to do with the fact that Vulcan doesn't denote. And the great puzzle there is that, on the one hand, what you do when you use such an empty name in an attribution is sort of not meaningless, but what you say doesn't have proper truth conditions according to the standards we apply. And at the same time, you can distinguish between, say, two such attributions in the sense that the one clearly seems right and the other seems not. And the great puzzle is, in what precise sense can we justify that intuitive distinction between true attributions of this kind and false ones? And I think in the interest of time, I will use the last minutes rather than going into the nitty-gritty of how we can make sense of such reports with empty names. Go to the very end and say a few things again about topics that I would have loved to discuss in detail, but there won't be time. And this is a kind of advertisement, I confess, but it's also to give you a flavor of the various things that not only can be addressed with the help of this formalism, but also that have already been addressed. And in this longer document that has been the introduction to MSDRT that's been put on the lectures website, you can read more about pretty much all these things. So let me just click to here. So this is just for you to think about yourselves, and you can, as I said, also find more on it. The case of Vulkan that we're going to discuss actually will have two different uses of the same sentence. One by people who, like this astronomer Le Verrier, who introduced Vulkan, believe, so there were people more or less at the time when this happened, believe that Vulkan actually did properly denote. Well, so they do actually do the same thing in communication that the people I was assuming do when they utter and interpret the sentence, John believes that Mary is in Paris. But of course there is some difference that Vulkan doesn't denote. And then there's another case where neither the speaker nor the interpreter actually believe, the sort of contemporaries of us, believe that Vulkan denotes, but nevertheless, they also can engage in communication involving such an attribution. Here we have a case of, I already mentioned very briefly, two people who both use the name and communicate right smoothly using it. The mother and the little son believes the center exists and the mother doesn't. And so it's sort of interesting to play through a few of these sentences as I say back and forth. I already said when the mother uses the name Santa, she uses it in a way we haven't yet described. For her, it's an empty name of sorts. She doesn't have an entity representation for Santa as a living person, but her son will actually falsely interpret her use of Santa as referring to what he takes to be the living Santa, and so adds these fake anchors to his own entity representation. There's much more to say about this, but the interesting question here is actually when you have said all these things about real and properly referring and not properly referring names, it's sort of interesting that that's so little of a problem when people talk about or communicate using such a name. Well, the mother must be, of course, be fairly careful that she doesn't trip up and so gives the game away. But even so, I mean, that's a strategy that parents are very good at developing very quickly. So that's one kind of case where you have exchanges between people where one believes that something is real, the other doesn't. The second, it's not quite the same thing, but it's also related to it. This is a problem that I found to be, or an issue that I found to be very important in connection with what actually motivated this longer document on the website. There was a course, a graduate seminar at the University of Texas in the spring. It was about mind and action, and so my co-author, Brenton learning, and Sylvester and I started doing is develop an extension or an application of MSDRT that can describe intentions and plans and their execution. And part of what you want there is a notion of, I call it individual concept, and I think it's a good word for it, although it's not exactly what logicians have classically understood by it. So look at this sentence here. So this is a woman, Hermione, who meets again after many years, say 2 decades, somebody, Alistair, who she's known quite well in the past, and she says to him, "You remember that house we wanted to build on the Cornish coast 20 years ago? Well, we built it at last. It's really wonderful. You must come and see it." And so pay attention, it's not very clearly seen, but I've bold-faced these pronouns here. They clearly refer back to this phrase, "that house we wanted to build on the Cornish coast." What there was at the time, and what she and Alistair shared at the time, was this concept of a house, maybe with certain features, to be built somewhere on the Cornish coast. In a way, that is still the same thing as the house she is now referring to, which is a house of flesh and blood, I'd almost said, wood and concrete. And the pronouns that occur here, they refer to that same thing in some sense. So this is a case where you have an individual concept that eventually may turn in the thing that it was meant to be from the start. So one way to model this is to have entity representations that don't yet have any kind of attachment, that have an empty anchor set, and in the course of time, they may be instantiated through an anchor. This anchor will then link the concept to this actual house that's been built. And then there is also a hot topic, I don't know how well that is anymore, but certainly was for a while, the so-called double vision cases like Hesperus and Phosphorus. Those have been with us for a long time. And London and Londra, and they have been with us for a long time, and there are many other examples also. And so that it's not a problem about empty names, but about different names for the same thing, and people who do not know or realize that these names actually do name the same thing. So there, the predicament is in one sense like what we get with these empty names. There's a sort of non-alignment very often between the attributor and the interpreter on the one hand, and the attributee on the other. But the misalignment here has to do with the fact that typically the attributor knows that it's one and the same object that these two names refer to, and the person to whom she wants to make an attribution doesn't. And how do we do that? How do we actually establish the connection we want to the one entity representation that was in the mind of the attributee at the time? And how do we establish the other? And that's sort of a matter, I don't know how much you can say about it, of convention that grows up within the speech community that leads to the fact that, when we use the name, do it again. The name phosphorus, we somehow understand understand within the community who mean what these people who didn't realize there was just this one planet Venus referred to when they talked about the thing you can see in the morning and Hesperus in the other, and exactly how these conventions come about. But they are essential to actually such reports working. And you can think about, you'll can download this later. When you look at these sentences, how old it actually is, or how much a matter of convention it is, that such reports can work at all. So time is up by more than a minute. So I must conclude today, and thank you again. And so next time we go seriously into the question of what you can say help using Vulkan, and then switch to a similar but also quite different issue that, or number of issues that arise for the use of names in relation to fiction. Thank you.